In the 1988 presidential campaign, while George H.W. Bush promised to address global warming with the power of what he called the White House effect, the George C. Marshall Institute, founded by Jastrow to support Reagan's Cold War anti-communism, began shifting its focus from the declining Soviet threat to environmental alarmism. How did Jastrow's sites and Nuremberg attempt to blame anthropogenic warming on the sun? And what does this reveal about the very concept of denial? Also, how did the IPCC relate to that dynamics, and why do we witness at the same time the foundation of the Global Climate Coalition?
In 1988, when George H.W. Bush, who has been vice president under Ronald Reagan, runs for office, he takes climate change seriously, and he makes a big speech where he says, those people who say we're powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect have never heard of the White House effect. And so he's saying if he's elected, he'll use the power of his office to do something. And of course, he does go to Rio de Janeiro, to the Earth Summit in 1992, and he signs the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he makes this commitment to do something about global warming. But at the same time, there's a lot of pushback. And this is where we really see the shift, the political shift in the Republican Party. So before Ronald Reagan, before 1980, many Republicans were environmentalists. Republicans had played a key role in the early environmental movement in the United States, going back to the 1900s and 10s and 20s. Republicans, progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, had played a key role in the creation of the National Forest Service, the expansion of the national parks, the setting aside of spectacular places. The Grand Teton National Park was a project of John D. Rockefeller. So many Republicans were active in the environmental movement in the first half of the century. Many Republicans had really cared about what sometimes historians called aesthetic environmentalism, protecting beautiful places for recreation, hunting, fishing, hiking, skiing. But it really changes in the Reagan administration. And it changes because of this relationship between environmental science and regulation. So starting in the late 60s and into the 70s, the U.S. federal government passes a set of laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Protection Act, which create a framework for environmental protection in the United States, not just to set aside a few places of conspicuous natural beauty, like the Grand Teton or the Grand Canyon or the redwood trees, all these big things, big trees, big canyons, big mountains, but more broadly to protect the environment for everyone. And so in some ways we can think of the second wave of environmentalism as being more democratic, with a little d, that is to say it's more about protecting the environment for all Americans, protecting the air that we all breathe. But it was still bipartisan. In the 1960s, you still had very widespread Republican support, and like the Wilderness Act is passed nearly unanimously in Congress. Richard Nixon signs the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He creates the EPA. So you have very broad bipartisan support. But it begins to shift. As these statutes are passed, you immediately begin to see pushback from industry. And you begin to see the chemical industry in particular, but also air polluting industries like electrical utilities, pushing back against this regulatory structure. And they begin to say America's over-regulated, that regulation is bad for the economy. What they really mean is it's bad for them personally, right? And this gets picked up by Reagan. And when Reagan runs for office, he specifically runs on an anti-regulatory platform and an anti-federal government platform, saying government's not the solution, government's the problem. And we're going to roll back these regulations and release the magic of the marketplace. This is one of Reagan's favorite lines. So this argument begins to be made, regulation is bad, the free market is good. To the extent that the federal government imposes regulations, the federal government is bad. You shouldn't like the federal government. You should be suspicious of the federal government. So it's really a crucial moment historically, especially in terms of what's understanding today, because it's the beginning of where we see the Republican Party turning against the federal government and attempting to turn the American people against the federal government. So this is all happening around this period, this crucial period in the late 80s. So when Bush gets elected and he wins office, but there's already a lot of pushback in Republican ranks. And we know in part from the work of a very wonderful graduate student in Switzerland, Audrey Lochscher. Not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but we can fix it. That there was a big fight inside the Bush administration. There were people in the Bush administration who did not think that he should go to Rio, that he should not sign the Framework Convention. And we know some of those people were actually directly linked to the ExxonMobil Corporation, including the science advisor E.E. David, who actually worked for ExxonMobil. So there's this whole argument taking place, and it's right at this moment that Nirenberg and his colleagues write their first climate denial report, in which they blame it on the sun. And so this becomes a key part of the strategy, to challenge the science by saying we don't really know what's causing this, and we don't know if it's greenhouse gases. It could just be natural variability. It could just be changes in the amount of sunshine that's reaching the planet. Now, they know that's false because Jim Hansen has already done the work that refutes that claim, but they misrepresent Hansen's work. They bring it to the White House and they say, we don't have to worry about this. We can, it just might be natural variability. And so the people in the Bush administration who are anti-regulation, don't want to see the administration do anything about climate change, they seize on this argument. And this then becomes one of the central arguments that's carried into the 1990s. Oh, it's just the sun. It's the wobble of the earth. And I have a little film clip I use frequently of Lee Raymond, who's the CEO of ExxonMobil in the 1990s, in which he's asked about global warming, and he says, oh, well, there's a lot of things that cause climate change. There's the wobble of the earth. There's sunspots. And this really encapsulates the strategy. It's not a lie, because there are sunspots. It's not a lie, because the earth does wobble. But it's grossly misleading, because in the context of climate change, those are not the things that are causing global warming. And the scientific community has said so explicitly, but he's denying what the scientific community is saying, trying to distract the audience by saying, oh, but there's all these other things. So it's deeply misleading, and this is the strategy that then we see the fossil fuel industry carry forward to, and even to the present day. I mean, you might think that the arguments about sunspots have gone away, but I could point you to corners of the internet where they are alive and well and being used to deny global warming. Second part of your question about Ben Santer. So as the 1990s developed, the attacks on science become fiercer and more disgraceful. And one of the most disgraceful was an attack on the scientist Ben Santer. So Ben was the lead author of the key chapter of the 1992 Second Assessment Report, which was the first time ever in history that the scientific community made a statement about attribution. And by that I mean to say, yes, we can attribute the observed warming to the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the statement is a pretty careful one. Ben Santer has written about this. They argued at great length about specific words, but the conclusion was that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on the global climate. And that was a pretty measured statement. It wasn't crazy, it wasn't alarmist, and it was agreed to by all of the scientists and the government representatives involved in that report. But the Wall Street Journal ran an attack on Ben, written by Fred Seitz, in which they claimed that he had inappropriately changed the report after it had gone through peer review. And it was really fascinating to me when I was writing about this, because I remember reading this and thinking, oh, that's actually what they did. That's what Bill Nirenberg did with the acid rain report. So he's committing scientific malfeasance and then claiming that the actual scientists are doing that. So you see a lot of projection in these stories, and now whenever I see one of these climate deniers accusing the scientific community of doing something, I think, oh, did he do that? So they accuse Ben of inappropriately changing the report. There's no evidence that this is true. And one of the really interesting things about this particular report is that one of the co-authors on this chapter was actually an ExxonMobil scientist, a man named Haroon Keshki. So if anyone would have been in a position to out Ben if he had done something wrong, it would have been Keshki, but he never did. And he's never, as far as I know, ever claimed that Ben did anything wrong. But this was splashed all over the pages of the Wall Street Journal and then repeated. And by the late 90s, we have the rise of the internet. So then you begin to see this claim repeated on the internet saying that, the Wall Street Journal had shown that Ben Santer had inappropriately changed this report. It was completely false, but it did a lot of damage. It did a lot of damage to Ben Santer personally, who really suffered a lot during this period. And it did a lot of damage to the credibility of the IPCC, because now a lot of people thought that the IPCC was fudging its reports.